Simchat Torah, a day that will perhaps for the rest of Jewish history be ever associated with the attacks that happened last year in Israel. Of course, the English date being October 7th, but the Hebrew date on the Jewish calendar, the idea of Simchat Torah. Simchat Torah, of course, the sad lachrymosity, the sad irony, the twisted sadism of the Hamas attacks is that Simchat Torah is perhaps one of the greatest Jewish holidays associated with joy, with dancing. Synagogues all across the world will see dancing happen, the Torah is taken out, people drinking, people having a festive atmosphere. Of course, also the October 7th attacks brought views and scenes of the Nova Festival, a different type of joy, a different type of dancing, of course, ruthlessly cut down by our enemies who are just interested in spreading violence and destruction everywhere we go. But the more I think about Simchat Torah, the more we revisit a year out from last year's October 7th attacks, the more I realize there's also symbolism that creeps up from this idea of the attack being on Simchat Torah. Of course, even inherent in the name Simchat Torah, right? Simcha meaning happiness and joy, Torah meaning Torah, our Jewish tradition, our texts. And if we think about it, the idea of Simchat Torah is truly how the Jewish people survived over thousands of years. It was our texts, it was our tradition, it was our holy books that allowed Judaism to go all throughout the diaspora, 2,000 years of lachrymosity, of exile, of sorrow, of an inquisition here, an expulsion there, a pogrom here. It was our texts that really allowed the Jewish world, the Jewish community, Jewish individuals to keep sight on what truly is important in life, to not give up hope, to realize that current material conditions, whatever time in Jewish history, whether this be the greatest time in Jewish history or much more likely some of the worst times in Jewish history, it was our texts, it was our Torah, it was our Jewish tradition that allowed Jews throughout the centuries to take refuge. You know, there was a famous literary scholar in the late 20th century, he actually passed away a couple years ago, named George Steiner. And George Steiner wrote a foundational essay, a powerful essay that I recommend everybody read. The essay was called Our Homeland, the Text. In it, ironically, George Steiner actually levies a critique of Zionism, but George Steiner's underlying point was that it truly has been our textual tradition, the Torah, the Talmud, medieval Jewish thought, Jewish law, that has grounded Jews over the centuries. It was our Torah, it was our tradition that allowed Jews to stay together. What other people have stayed together after 2,000 years of exile and diaspora? Do you know how many peoples and ethnic groups and religious groups and ancient tribes there were in the Iron Age 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago that we have no writings from, that we have no recollections from? There were probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of peoples lost to the dustbin of history. But us, a tiny nomadic tribe from the ancient Iron Age, wandering throughout the Middle East, wandering throughout the desert, wandering throughout Mesopotamia. We know that ancient Israel was a vassal to the Egyptian Empire, to the Assyrian Empire, taken over by the Babylonians, conquered by Alexander the Great, taken over by King Cyrus before that. But us, the Jewish people, our ability to survive in the last couple of thousand years has to point to something inside us, a striving for positivity, striving for being forward-looking. And it's all thanks to our textual tradition, the ideas that ground us in Jewish tradition, the ideas that link us one generation to another. Every year, Simchat Torah is when we make the pivotal switch. We finish out the Torah on one side, and then we stop for about 5 minutes, and then we start the Torah on the other end. And this switch from ending the Torah and then immediately starting the Torah is a homage to the idea in Judaism that we view time as both linear and cyclical. Of course, time goes on, the seasons change, years pass, the world changes, we get older, the conditions of the world around us change, but there are some ideas that are cyclical, some ideas that are timeless. As time moves on, the world changes, but there are some symbolisms, some ideas, some values, some truths that are true generation after generation. I'm thinking a lot about the Genesis story, the story of Adam and Eve being plopped into the Garden of Eden, the snake, not just because we're about to read this in synagogue this week, not just because I'm teaching a course at UCI all about ancient texts, and we've been using this story as one of our foundational texts. But I think this text, the more I read it, the more I read the first few chapters of Genesis, namely and mostly Genesis 3, where the drama of Eden unfolds, the more I realize this is a true reflection for really the modern existential human condition. Let me explain. You know, at the beginning of the story, Adam and Eve are dropped into the garden, and again, This is obviously screams mythological story. Of course, there have been those throughout history that have attempted to view this story as historical, those that want to argue the world is 5,000 or 6,000 years old. But this is, of course, never how the story meant to be taught, never how the story meant to be read. This is a story about our past, but not just our collective past, also our collective present. This is a story about us every single day. Every single person goes through their own story of the Garden of Eden. At the beginning, Adam and Eve are simpletons. They're young, they're naive, and they don't know anything. They're wandering throughout the garden. Life is all set out for them. All they need to do is eat from the trees, hang out with the animals. They have no worries in life. But of course, this doesn't mean that the world was perfect. This just means that Adam and Eve were blinded to the realities of the world. They had yet to grow up. They were still living in this naive, juvenile fantasy where you look around and you think everything is taking control. Perhaps your parents know what's best for you. Perhaps your teachers know what's best for you. In a religious context, perhaps there's religious clergy that know what's best for you. And when you're young and when you're naive, you think somebody must have this all taken care of. At the root, somebody, be it a politician, be it a teacher, be it somebody running the show, there's some hand behind society that is able to make good choices and able to figure things out for us. You know, the snake in the story gets a bad rap, right? Of course, the snake has a whole interpretive history. Perhaps the snake is the devil. Perhaps the snake is the evil inclination. But what if the snake is good, right? Imagine this. Adam, Eve, they're sitting there in the garden. They're blinded to the reality of the world. They think the world is perfect. They're living in their own internal utopia where there's no challenges, there's no pain, there's no suffering, there's no death. Snakes in the ancient world actually don't represent slyness and cynicism. Snakes actually, in much of the ancient world, represent health and immortality. The idea that snakes shed skin led many in the ancient world to actually think that snakes never died. They just shedded their past layer and moved on. Again, the idea of cyclical time as opposed to linear. We see this in the ancient Babylonian epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the king Gilgamesh, after realizing that his young friend dies, he ends up going on this whole quest to find a tree that gives infinite life. You can obviously see the parallels to Genesis here. Only for this tree or this plant, after Gilgamesh finds it, to be stolen by a snake. The snake ends up eating the plant, and the snake is given immortality. In ancient Egypt, snakes were used in all sorts of healing rituals. For those that want a more Torah-focused or more Jewish-focused example, even in the book of Numbers, right? If you remember, there's this fascinating story where the Israelites break out in plague, and Moses, in order to heal him, makes this giant copper snake and tells the Israelites, look at that snake up there. And if you look at that snake up there, it will actually heal you. Even today, if you Google the emblem of the medical system, you see a staff with a snake wrapped around it. Snakes in much of the ancient world represented immortality, represented the part of the animal world that isn't mortal, that isn't the material. And so perhaps the snake in the Genesis story represents the part of us, the part of humanity that's more than just our material, that's more than just our animalistic-like tendencies. The snake can perhaps represent this drive within us to achieve something greater, to do more than just our material bodies allow us to do, the eternal within us. Call it our soul, call it our conscious, call it our intellect, whatever you want to use. The snake represents the part of us that's always searching for more, always questioning. And of course, we know throughout human history, this idea of human consciousness, the soul, the intellect, the idea of humanity to think critically and to question and to challenge and to be critical can, of course, be used both for good and bad. The snake is a neutral creature in the story, but the snake is pushing, right? The snake inside of us is constantly pushing us to look around us and to take in knowledge, to take in information, to question the circumstances of where we're on. Humans seek knowledge. It's a part of humanity. If there's information, the easiest way to tell somebody, the easiest way to get somebody to read something, to learn something, is to tell them, you are not allowed to know this. All of a sudden, everybody in the world wants to know exactly what this thing is about. This is what happens in Eden. This is what happens to us every single day. We're plopped into a situation. We're plopped into the world as babies, as naive creatures with very little or fleeting consciousness. And as we grow up in the world, we take in a multiplicity of experiences. We talk to people with different views than us. We learn, we come across ideas that we disagree with. We all, in some sense, eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve's listening to the snake is really just their own consciousness driving them to look around the garden and say, there must be something missing here. The world can't just be this picturesque, perfect garden full of all these trees, full of all these animals, without any suffering, without any work, without any death. There has to be more. But of course, each one of us, once we eat from the tree of knowledge and good and evil, something both incredible and something terrible happens. We immediately understand this is what happens to Adam and Eve, but it happens to each one of us. We immediately understand that the Garden of Eden is a myth. The walls melt down. It just isn't real. The Garden of Eden has never existed. What we thought just minutes ago to be a world full of perfection, full of utopia, we realize that the world is full of suffering. By the sweat of your brow, you should have to work, God says to them immediately after they eat from the tree. From dust you came, from dust you will go back. They're going to die. And usually we interpret these as punishments for Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But these aren't punishments. This is Adam and Eve being awoken to the reality of the world. Even before that, the world wasn't perfect. They just didn't gain the consciousness, the awareness, the intellectual, the philosophical, the moral knowledge to realize it. And so Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge. And similar to us, every time we gain some awareness of the world around us, we realize the world isn't perfect. We realize the brokenness of the world. We realize that the world oftentimes is full of unfairness, unjustness, with undue suffering. Similar to the epic of the Plato's cave, like the prisoners coming out of the Plato's cave who spent their entire lives viewing the world through these shadows on the wall. Once they realize that there's a way out of the cave, they have no choice but to keep climbing up. No matter how much the rays of the sun are burning the eyes of the prisoners, once they realize that the sun is somewhere outside of the cave, they have no choice but to keep on going out of the cave, even as they're being burnt by the rays of sun, the rays of truth. For us as humans, once we begin the journey, once we begin to question that around us, once we begin to challenge our current worldview, once we grow up, once we realize that our parents, our teachers, our politicians, our rabbis don't have all the answers in the world, we have no choice but to keep climbing out of the cave. You can either stay in Plato's cave and not think, or you can go out of the cave, but you can't do both. So we leave Eden. Adam and Eve get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and they look around, and we look around as we gain in our awareness and consciousness of the world, and we realize that this world is full of pain. It's full of suffering. It's full of the fact that humans have to spend most of their time working. It's full of the screaming fact that we are no longer in the Garden of Eden. And then, of course, at the end of the story, we learn the most crushing of facts, that life is temporary, that we are mortal, that we eventually die. Adam and Eve, it's not a mistake. The first thing they do after eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil is they then look to the tree of life, right? The tree of life didn't really appear in the story before that. It wasn't a major role. Before Adam and Eve had consciousness, before they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the tree of life was irrelevant. If you're living in perfection, if you're living in utopia, you don't really think about your own mortality. Everything is perfect. What do you have to worry about? But all of a sudden, we gain awareness of the world. Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And all of a sudden, they realize their own mortality. They realize the suffering. They realize the unjustness in the world. And they want a quick fix. They want to rectify. And so they want to go eat from the tree of life. They want to say, I want to reinsert myself into Eden. I want to trade, right? The eating of the tree of life is not saying you want knowledge and eternal life. It's saying I want to trade. I want to undo my knowledge. I want to reinsert myself into the Garden of Eden. I want out. I don't want this knowledge. If knowledge comes suffering and knowledge comes awareness that the world isn't perfect, I'm going to take Eden over the knowledge of the garden of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so they want to reinsert themselves into the utopia of Eden, but it's too late. You can either have moral awareness or you can have the Garden of Eden. But once you achieve moral awareness and intellectual awareness and philosophical awareness, the Garden of Eden's doors are closed. There's no way to get back in there. And this is very much how society feels right now. There's been much written about in the last 150 years that we're in a secular age. Friedrich Nietzsche in the 1800s proclaimed the death of God, not as a triumphalism of science and rationality, but as a lamentation. God is dead and we have killed him, right? Where do we go for meaning? Where do we go for existential value once we realize that we're not in the Garden of Eden, that this world is full of pain and suffering? Many of us in the Jewish community this past year have had our eyes awoken to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism within our friend groups, anti-Semitism within the same liberal and progressive groups that just years earlier we were at the forefront of, anti-Semitism within our schools, anti-Semitism within our political system, anti-Semitism, of course, within the global political community. And again, just like Adam and Eve, once you have awareness, you can't unsee it. Our eyes have been open in many recent years. We've left the Garden of Eden of thinking that there's some entity out there that has our best interests. It's certainly not the government. It's certainly not corporations. It's certainly not the technological sector. We have huge corporations destroying the world. The food industry is corrupt. The climate corporations are breeding endless climate change. There's nuclear proliferation happening all over the world by nefarious actors. The world is very far from the Garden of Eden. The punishment / prophetic speech of God after Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge is more relevant now than ever. Not only are we not in the Garden of Eden, but we live in a world full of hardship, full of suffering, full of sadness and lachrymosity. But Jewish tradition doesn't end with this depressing view of the world. In fact, Jewish tradition begins with this depressing view of the world. The first story in our tradition is the story of leaving Eden. And so this is when Jewish tradition starts. That the recognition of all of this, the fact that we're not in the Garden of Eden, the fact that our world is broken, the fact that there's much in the world needing fixing, is the first step for us as humans, as people in the Jewish community, as people who want to make the world a better place. The recognition of the brokenness is the first step towards fixing. The fact that Jewish tradition really gives us each an imperative to actually go out and better the world in some way. Many Kabbalistic scholars have noted that the reason why you break a glass at a wedding, think about it, the happiest time the couple is about to start their life, and the first thing you do is break a glass, remembering the fact that the world is broken. Because in order for a couple to begin the work of fixing the world, of bringing more love into the world, of bringing more wholeness, of bringing more peace into the world, you need to begin with the recognition that things are broken. And so Jewish tradition across the last 2,000 years has been a life force, not because of all of the lachrymosity and sorrow and suffering that Jews have experienced over the last 2,000 years, but despite all of the suffering that Jews have gone through over the last couple of thousand years. Jews have always realized that our job in the world has not been to sit around and to complain and to lament and to give up hope, but rather figure out what is the small part of our world that we can actually fix. How do we actually take our job, our ability, our intellect, our view of the world, our strengths, and how do we actually begin that fixing? This Jewish tradition, this understanding has been why, against all odds throughout history, Jews have been able to survive, because we're not naive to the problems of the world, but we don't shirk away from them. We understand problems as things that could eventually be solved. At the end of the Eden story, there's a recognition that once you gain awareness, once you grow up, once you realize the brokenness of the world, you can never go back into Eden. But maybe, just maybe, the idea is that you can create a little bit of the Garden of Eden here in our own world.